Hey guys, I want to take you through an example that I run all my students through very early on in their program because I don't want them to get fixated on a visual assessment and use that visual assessment to make assumptions on whether something is tight, something is weak, whether they have to drive flexion versus extension, extension versus flexion, because you really just don't know. You can't make those assumptions just by looking at someone, because someone can have the same compensation, but that compensation can manifest into different limitations and different restrictions, and it's the same movement problem. So the example I use with my students is shoulder flexion and hip flexion. And we talk about how the body gives you checks and balances so you don't drive emotion too far. For example, shoulder flexion, your body gives you about 180 degrees of shoulder flexion. And to stop you from going past that, it has certain ligaments keeping that in check. Anything past 180 degrees, we would call that hypermobility, pathology, whatever you want to call it. Same thing with hip flexion. Your body only allows you to have a certain amount of degrees of hip flexion, and that is something that you would need for a deadlift. In order for you to deadlift, you need to be able to take your hips through the motion, which we call hip flexion. And the students, I get them very early on before they have anatomy. So I try to use very little anatomy terms. So what I told them is, let's say the body only gives you 4 hip flexions. So in order for you to do a perfect deadlift, you need 4 hip flexions. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, and you have a nice looking deadlift. But let's say that your starting point or your resting point or your resting posture, however you want to call it, is already at 1. So your pelvis is already either oriented or rotated in a position of hip flexion, anterior pelvic tilt. And you can't walk around like this. You have to compensate and arch your back in order to look straight ahead, but you're already walking around with 1 or 2 hip flexions and you've only got 2 left. So if you're already at 2, you've got your 3, you've got your 4. In order for you to get all the way down to the ground, you're going to have to start rounding your back. And what most people think here is this person needs to drive more extension because they round over with a deadlift. But in reality, they need to start from a position of more of extension and not full extension. Just driving a little bit more extension will allow that person to deadlift more with a straight back. So the person that looks like this, they don't need extension. What they need is to start more in a position closer to 1 or 0. If you're talking about power lifters, maybe 3. Just buying someone a little bit of hip extension allows them to hinge a little better without compromising and rounding through their low back. So that is why you can't trust your eyes, because if you just look at someone who's rounding over with a deadlift, you can make the assumption that that person needs to learn how to extend their thorax because they're rounding their thorax, but that's usually not the case.